All right, something a little bit different today. We're going to do more of a devotional kind of thing for Holy Week. We will not get to Good Friday, but we will take care of Palm Sunday through right around Thursday. We'll come back to Good Friday on Sunday. So if you would join me in the Gospel of John, John chapter 12 and 13. It might also be helpful for you to have something to write with, because I'm going to stop from time to time and ask you to not just consider what we're talking about, but maybe write down a couple of thoughts. This is by no means intended to be an hour-long conversation, so I do hope that you will take the handout that you have and continue to work on this as you leave. So I'm going to read from the ESV tonight. This is John 12 and 13. The next day, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem. So they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." Most of us know this text fairly well, right? Most of us think about Palm Sunday. Most of us have probably been in churches where, the kids will participate in some activity about palm leaves and those kind of things, just welcoming Jesus in. Seems to be that they're celebrating the arrival of the Messiah, right? Or are they? Are they really celebrating who Jesus is, or what they want him to be? Let me offer a couple of thoughts here and have you just reflect on these thoughts. Just a couple of 100 years earlier, prior to this, in 200 BC, there's the Seleucid Empire was gaining traction. So you had the Romans that were really, really powerful, the biggest empire in the world. And you also had these Greeks, the Seleucids. As I said, they were gaining traction, and the Jews had this rebellion against the Seleucid Empire. The Jews were led by Judas Maccabeus. I don't know if you've ever heard that name before, but Judas Maccabeus was a son of a guy named Matthias, who was the first, I guess you could say, high priest between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So think about intertestamental period between Malachi and Matthew. And Judas Maccabeus instilled this idea of we're going to be the people of God. We're going to be the chosen people of God, the Jews. And so what that meant for people in the ancient Near East, especially 200 years prior to Jesus being born and then afterwards, was we got to a place where they're waving palm branches because palm branches became a symbol of rebellion of Jews toward Gentiles. In this case, the Jews toward the Seleucid Empire. And a couple of 100 years later, as Jesus enters the city, as we mentioned, it's no longer the Seleucids that are powerful, now it's the Romans. And their goal is to have Jesus overthrow the Romans. And they shout, "Hosanna," right? Most of us think of that as a welcoming term. It's, but it carried a political message. It was here's our guy, right? He's the guy. He's the one that God has sent. He's not only our deliverer, but he's the conquering king. And it meant they wanted liberation. They wanted salvation from their oppressors. Again, their oppressors were the Romans. But is that why he came? A conquering king would be riding into town on a white stallion, right? A signal of power. But how does Jesus ride in? If you'll notice later on in this text, he rides in on the foal of a donkey. And that's to fulfill prophecy from the Old Testament, but it's also to show that he's not their conquering king. He's not their guy, right? If you're a Republican, you have your guy. If you're a Democrat, you have your guy, right? If you're an independent, you probably have your guy. But Jesus was never been about national politics. Jesus has always been about the world. Jesus has always been about the gospel. Jesus has always been about bigger than things that we can ever imagine. So what does all this have to do with us? A couple of questions you might think about. Do we submit to his agenda, or do we maintain our own? In other words, there are people on all sides of that political spectrum that I just mentioned who claim Jesus as their own. You know, Jesus is he's a good Republican. He would be against XYZ. And then other people on the other side would say, no, Jesus is a good Democrat. He would take care of the poor. He would do the things that the Democrats are typically known to do. But Jesus wasn't concerned about that. He was concerned about his Father's mission, first and foremost. That was always his plan. So he rides into town on a small donkey and not that big white stallion that the conquering king would ride in on. And signifying the gospel is much bigger. I don't know if you've ever thought about that when it came to Holy Week, and especially to Palm Sunday. But I think that's something that we ought to consider this evening. They welcome him to Jerusalem, but it's not in the sense of the Messiah that he was. They wanted him to be the Messiah they wanted him to be. They wanted to place him in a box. So here's the question: what box have you put Jesus in? What teaching are you ignoring? What are you refusing to give up? So I think what we'll do this evening is I'll give you a couple of maybe 30 seconds, 45 seconds to consider those questions before we move on to the next one. Does all this make sense? Just like always, if you have a question about this, if you're confused about something, let me know. But I'm convinced that we all put Jesus in a box. I'm convinced that we put God in a box. We all have this idea that Jesus should be whatever that fill in the blank is, right? And when he's contrary to that, when he goes against our idea, then it kind of frustrates us, doesn't it? It disappoints us. It frustrates us. It maybe at times angers us. Remember, these are the same people who are clamoring to crucify him just a couple of days later. Isn't that amazing? Right? How we can all welcome Jesus one day, and the next day we're calling for his life. So again, what box have you put Jesus in? What teaching are you ignoring? And what are you refusing to give up? Do we understand ourselves to be created in the image of God, or do we create God in our image? And I'll let you hang with that for 30 seconds or so, and we'll move on to the next one. Anybody with an idea about how we put Jesus in a box? Any thoughts on that?
Naturally, our limited knowledge of him, so that limits him, and also the way I want to see him.
All right, let's go to the next day. Let's go to the next morning. Let's go to Mark chapter 11, 12 through 14. Mark 11, 12 through 14. Mark 11, verses 12 through 14. On the following day, when they, being Jesus and the apostles, came from Bethany, Jesus was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it. You guys are aware of this text too, right? Where he curses the fig tree. He left the city, spends the night in the town of Bethany, which is just a couple of miles outside of Jerusalem. The next morning he sees this fig tree. The text is clear. The tree has leaves but no fruit. Do you know spiritual people who look the part? They go to church, they wear a cross, they carry their Bible, they say the right things. They may be here at Easter, on Easter Sunday, but there's no fruit. How might we worry about external leaves and not fruit? What does that look like? Maybe we go to a Sunday school class. Maybe we go to a Bible study on a Wednesday night, or a small group on Wednesday night. Maybe we play the part, but we're not really growing fruit. So is your life producing something that will last? Is your life producing something that will last, or is it just about going through the motions? Well, we talked a lot about, recently especially, about being religious versus having a relationship with Jesus. Or another way to say it is, what in your life is drawing people to Jesus? What in your life is drawing people to Jesus? In Galatians 5, 22, 23, James led a study here recently through the fruit of the Spirit. Of course, you all know that is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. I guess that's probably a good measuring stick for are we making fruit? Are we being fruitful? I think about the John 15 text where Jesus says, "Abide, remain in me, you bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." Well, that fruit that you're talking about is not apples and oranges, right? It's a spiritual fruit like love and self-control and kindness and goodness and all those things. And this is not for the baby Christians. I understand that, but we have to understand that following Jesus isn't about what you say, it's about making fruit. It's about setting fruit. So the next morning, the disciples see the dead fig tree. I don't know if you saw that or not. This is verse 20 and following. As they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. The next morning. It didn't take long, did it? And Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered." And then Jesus answers him, "Have faith in God. I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that he says will come to pass, it will be done for him." So, what feeds you? I mean, what are you hungry for? I was thinking about this the other day when I was preparing some of this. Is what am I hungry for? What stokes the flame of the Holy Spirit in my life? Or what influences me? What influences you? We've talked about the word church before, the ecclesia, the called out ones. We're to be different than the rest of the world, but most of the time we're influenced by the world and not influencing the world, if you hear the difference. What's healthy about the inside and not just looking good on the outside? I remember Jesus telling the Pharisees, you know the Pharisees, right? The religious leaders of the day. He said, "You're whitewashed tombs. You look good on the outside, but inside you are decaying." you're dying. And then finally, let me give you a couple of seconds to consider these. Do you have someone in your life to speak into your faithfulness? We're called to be disciples. We're called to hold each other accountable. Do you have somebody in your life, somebody that comes to mind right away, that can call you out when you're lacking faith, that can call you out when you need to be faithful, that can say, remember you're a follower of Jesus. Remember, you're supposed to be bearing fruit. Remember, do you have somebody in your life that can speak into your faithfulness? If not, you need to have someone. Most of the time that's male to male, female to female. Not always, but for the most part that's the way it is. And you need somebody in your life that can be very, very honest with you. I know people, I know believers who are not comfortable with that at all. They don't like the idea of accountability, so they just surround themselves with yes people. You know, how do you think I'm doing? Well, you're doing fine, man. You know. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about accountability. Somebody that you can actually ask the question, hey, what do you see in my life? Oh man, you got an anger problem, or you got a, you know, whatever your struggle is, right? There's somebody that can see, that knows you well enough to say something is not right. And you also I'll be asking those people, how do you see me bearing fruit? How is it that I'm bearing fruit? Don't tell me I've been to Sunday school the last 4 weeks. Okay, that's great. But no, really, how am I bearing fruit? You know, why did Jesus curse the fig tree? You know, because it wasn't bearing fruit. That's the whole point. And why are they shocked the next morning when they say, hey, look, Rabbi, the tree that you just cursed is dead? Right? I wonder how many people, and I'm talking to myself for a second, how many people, followers of Jesus Christ, look good on the outside, but we're not bearing fruit. So this is a question about getting real, right? This is a question about listening for both things that make you proud. You know, I'm pretty proud of God's grace in that area of my life where God is doing some great things. But it's also an opportunity for you to hear the challenges where you failed Jesus. You know, I ask the elders at elders meetings sometimes. I said, "Would you do me a favor? Would you tell me when you were closest to Christ this last week or before we met last time? When were you closest to Christ?" That's usually pretty easy for people to come up with, right? And it'll be a ministry. It'll be, you know, I got to share the gospel. It'll be all these things, right? We'll get that question out of the way. Then you ask the question, okay, when did you fail Christ? That's a little bit harder to answer. Those are questions you need to be asking. It doesn't have to be an elders meeting. It can be believer to believer, right? Brother to brother, sister to sister. Accountability. We all need that, right? If we want to grow, we need that. And so my challenge to you is to think of yourself as a fig tree. Would you be bearing fruit? Well, let's go to the...
Why did he curse the fig tree when it was out of season?
Well, because it had leaves on it.
But it said it was out of season in my Bible.
It does, but I don't think it's about the fig tree. I don't, and the reason I say that is because it wasn't. There's nothing to fig tree. The fig tree is just a fig tree, right? But I think he wants his apostles. I think he wants his disciples. I think he's trying to get them to understand that, hey, here fairly soon I'm going to the cross. And we'll talk more about this as we go. But some of you are going to, you've been with me for 3.5 years. You see what I'm saying? You understand what I'm saying?
Time to stand on your own.
Yeah, somewhat. But how many of us today, right? We have more than they ever had as far as this. I mean, they walked with Jesus, on a day-to-day basis. I get that. But we have more We have the Word that they didn't have. They had the Old Testament, they didn't have the New Testament. In fact, they witnessed some of the New Testament that we had. But we're no different. We're no different than the apostles. And they're, you know, I think he would say the same thing to us. You need to bear fruit. I mean, you guys push back on this if you disagree with this, but I think there's a lot of people in churches, I'm not talking about Southwestern Christian Church necessarily, although we're included. I think there are a lot of people in churches that think that they just adhere to certain beliefs. You know, I gotta believe that Jesus is I gotta believe in Jesus, and that's it. They walk the aisle, they get in the baptistry, I get all that. But I mean, in their mind, there's nothing about bearing fruit. There's nothing about discipleship. It's just consumerism. You understand what I'm saying? It's just coming to God. It's manipulation. I mean, let's just call it what it is, right? It's coming to God, wanting something from God, but not wanting to put anything in. I see a lot of confused looks. You guys want to push back on that?
And I might be getting ahead of you on this, but John 15.
You probably are seeing it live. Go ahead.
John 15, it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does not bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Already you are clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself, unless it abides in the vine. Neither can you, unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing.
Yeah.
So that's just where my mind goes when I think of the fig tree, and I think it's just a true reflection of that, and that it reflects our faith and our relationship with Christ, because those who are just walking the part or looking the part, they have no ability to bear that fruit without Christ.
Yeah.
And
So two things, I think you're spot on. I think two things that text that you just read for us, it says, number one, it says, those who aren't bearing fruit, he will cut off and throw away, right? The other one, it says pruning, the word pruning. Man, pruning would take, it hurt, right? It'd be devastating to a tree. I mean, I was reading in my time with God yesterday, I believe it was yesterday. Again, James 1, 2 through 4, it says, consider it joy, my brothers. He's talking to people with a dispersion. We've been talking about dispersion in our Bible class on Sunday. And he says, consider it joy, or count it all joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of various kinds. Not if, but when, right? And they're definitely being pruned. They're definitely going through the ringer. They're going through the hard times, right? But what does he say in that text in John 15? He says, if I prune you, what's going to happen?
So that more fruit.
You're going to put out more fruit. If you've done any kind of work with trees before, you know that a healthy tree needs pruning, right? When you prune the tree at the right time, in the right way, that healthy tree is going to provide more fruit. It's going to give off more fruit. But it hurts at the time, right? I know nothing about apple trees, but I've got an apple tree out there, and there's something about grafting. So if anybody knows about grafting or anything like that about apple trees, and cutting notches in an apple tree, so I don't know anything about it. I've just got an apple tree, you know what I'm talking about? But I also know that when I think about it, it's not the time to cut the notches in the apple tree, because it does more damage than it does good. What I do know is when God cuts notches in us, or he allows us to go through the struggles that James 1 was talking about, or we suffer from time to time. The text goes on in James 1 to say, because it develops steadfastness. Steadfastness produces, character, hope, all these kind of things. But it's that pruning that's tough. It's the going through the fire. It's hard, right? Thank you for sharing that. I
So
appreciate
let
it.
me ask you this. So at the beginning, if they don't bear no fruit,
There's two different responses in that text, right?
right?
One is you cut off. One is you're cut off. The second one is the healthy way. You're going to be pruned anyway. But you want to be pruned,
Yeah.
right? Because it makes you the person you're supposed to be. Most oftentimes, though, we don't like pain. We don't like struggle. We don't like the hardship of Christianity. We don't like that. I say we because I'm talking about we. All right.
This to me reflects back to what you talked about from day one about their relationship, with God. That if you're not going to put out any effort to be part of that relationship, just like a relationship with a marriage or with a friendship, if you don't put out any effort to become part of that relationship, it's not going to bear any fruit.
Yeah, I think all too often we say we love someone or something, but we don't really.
Kind of one-sided. It's like, I want you to come and help me when I need.
That's the manipulation I'm talking about. That's the way Elton and I've talked about that a lot when we talk about prayer. Most of the time people pray with manipulation. They think, okay, God, give me. God is saying, hey, I've offered you opportunity. You're not involved here. You're not invested here. Yeah.
We need to talk about discipline here. About, like, when no one's around, you're gonna do the same thing as if several people are watching you. I was at Walmart and I saw it was real cold and dark, and this guy I knew, he was in college. He always kind of looked, this guy's gonna do the right thing. Well, he just pushed that cart, he got through the car, he just pushed it. Where it's going, it's somebody's car, later. He knew nobody was seeing it, but I happened to be sitting in the car. It's just like when nobody's around and seeing you, are you still gonna do the right thing? Are you still gonna do the godly thing?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah. Integrity.
yeah. Well, and then discipline, there's a discipline to that too. Nobody's around, I can do it the other way,
Yeah. Yeah, the cursing the fig tree is always an interesting text. I'd like you to hang out with that more this week, if you can, the rest of the week. Let's look at Matthew 24. Matthew 24. Jesus is speaking here, obviously. He's been teaching. I'm going to read verses 3 and 4, and then we'll drop down to verse 6. Well, I'll read verse 5 as well. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming of the end of the age?" Do you know people that are so caught up in trying to figure out when Christ is coming back? I mean, they spend 90% of their time, looking on YouTube or following certain people, trying to figure out when's Christ coming back. Oh, there's another conflict in the world. I guess we're getting closer and closer. Well, we've always been getting closer and closer. Do you understand that, right? But if we get so caught up in the secondary issues, we're going to miss the primary. If that makes sense. So they're asking him right here, tell us about these end days. When will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, I'm the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And that's exactly what they did. There were many people that claimed to be the Messiah. There were many people that claimed to be the one sent from God. And they led people astray. We at Southwestern have been talking about 1 John. We've been talking about this word Antichrist. And we're not talking about just one individual. We're talking about anything that leads you away from God, anything that draws you away from God. And look at verse 6. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed. For this must take place, but the end is not yet. Now this is a part of the next two chapters into chapter 26. I think it's verse 2, maybe verse 3, right at the first part of chapter 26. Yeah, verse 2, it says, when he finished saying these things. This is what's called the Olivet Discourse. And it's a lengthy teaching section of the gospel where Jesus speaks of the trouble that the disciples will have. You know, this is not going to be easy road. This is not going to be, and they lived happily ever after when it comes to Christianity. How many of you like your comfort? Anybody? I've been cold all day. How many of them? You follow what I'm saying? Right? We like to be comfortable. And the key question I think here is, are you willing to follow Jesus to the end? I mentioned that James 1 text where it says, consider it joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials. Not if, but when. I think about the Gospel of Luke where Jesus says, consider the cost. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? Right? He says, take up your cross. We're going to talk a little bit, I may talk a little bit about this on Sunday, but most of us have taken that idea of the cross. When he says, take up your cross and follow me, we think of that more of a spiritual metaphor. And Jesus didn't mean that as a spiritual metaphor, and they wouldn't have heard it as a spiritual metaphor. When they were walking on the road towards Jerusalem and they were seeing people that were, you know, most of the time it was rebels or it was slaves. That was what crucifixion was for, right? The less than. Humiliated people that were hanging on the side of the road, right? And so what's he saying when he says, take up your cross and follow me? He's saying, give it all away. Give everything that you are away. Take up your cross. That meant follow him to the end, right? No matter what it cost you. So when people say, well, I'll follow you, Jesus, and he says, do you know what you're saying, right? Foxes have dens. Foxes have places to stay. I don't even know where I'm going to lay my head tonight. Well, I'll follow you, Jesus. Just let me go bury my father. No, let the dead bury the dead. I'll just give me a second. I'll follow. No. Are you going to follow? Are you going to see? There's a whole other level when it comes to being a follower of Jesus, right? This is going to scare a lot of people away. This is why a lot of people do fall away, because they were never part, right? Well, faith means we lack nothing, despite the suffering and pain. In other words, God provides everything that we need. And that suffering and that pain, they're all temporary. Those who remain faithful will endure and have a stronger faith. I mentioned this to you on Sunday, and I think it's something to at least allude to again tonight. Paul says to keep your eye on the finish line. Don't worry about all the stuff out here, right? All the stuff out here is going to try to lead you astray. There's a lot of distractions right here, right? But if you follow all the way, if you follow me all the way to the finish line, if you persevere, we saw that in 1 John. You see it again in Revelation. If you persevere to the end, you will be saved. Right? That perseverance is something that takes some effort. I'm going to focus, right? The reason that Paul is speaking and about Jesus, the reason he's singing worship songs in the prison is because he's focused on the finish line. Because he's sold out, right? Do you have resilience or grit to see it through? Are you willing to hang out with Jesus? Not just hang out, but you know what I'm talking about. To the end? Or when the first rattle of pain happens, when you see you're in a fight, are you going to fall away? A lot of people do. You can give up, or you can come out with stronger faith. Right? You can get up, you can dust yourself off, and you can get back on the horse, so to speak, whatever. So here's the question. Do you know someone who's going through difficulty right now? I'm sure you all do. Maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's somebody who had good intentions, started out strong, and then kind of started becoming more of a spectator than a follower of Jesus. If that describes somebody that you know, don't just pray for them. Don't tell them that you're going to pray for them. Go and pray with them. Oh, Mike, I could never do that. I could never pray. I could never. You're a follower of Jesus, right? You should go pray with them. That's what we're called to do. I think it's a cop-out. and this may get me stoned and thrown out. What I think it's a cop-out to say, I'm going to pray for you, and then I'll walk away. I think that's too easy. Now, I know I'm a preacher. I get all that. But do you understand what I'm saying? I think people say, well, I'll pray for you. Or you see something on Facebook, right? And I keep going back to social media because that's the world in which we live. But somebody will post something, I'm really struggling with this. What's the first thing that people post?
Oh, pray.
Prayers.
Yeah.
Prayers. And I'm like, bull crap. Why don't you go pray with that person? You understand what I'm saying? This is going to the next level. It's too easy to say prayers or I'm praying for you. Right? Now sometimes we do that with good intentions. I get all that, but man, Jesus never called us to a comfortable way of living. It was all about going and doing and changing the world. And we just get so lazy. We get so laissez-faire. We get so caught up in ourselves that we say things like that, and they sound good on the surface, but go and pray with those people.
I don't know how many times go ahead.
I agree with what you're saying, because there have been times definitely that I have said it and I have not followed through. But I also know that without the prayers of the prayer warriors that I know in my life, over me and my family, we would not be where we are today.
Sure.
And whenever it is followed through, and whenever it is done, it is the most important thing that they can be doing for me in my trials.
Yeah. Well, that's the other part of that is too, that here's encouragement. If you've ever heard somebody pray out loud for you, lay their hands on you. I can think back to my ordination. The guys that were standing around me with their hands on me, praying for me. That's a humbling place to be. I mean, it's a special place to be. And it's one thing for the preacher to do that for you, but that's what the preacher's supposed to do. You know, I understand that mentality. But when you go out of your way to go and pray and not just say, I'm praying for you, that's a whole different level.
I don't know how many times my oldest daughter, there'll be somebody on the phone, and although they're 200, 300 miles away, she'll say, okay, before I hang up, I'm gonna pray for you, over the phone, and I just think that's a big effort too. If you're not standing right there with them, if you can't get to them,
Yeah.
like say to
But
go
at least
and pray
hear.
with them, but they're hearing.
They
your
hear,
prayer.
that's right. Or to write a card with a prayer in it. It's huge, big impact. All right, let's keep going. Matthew 26. Hang out with that Mount of Olives text later on this week. This is Matthew 26, 14 through 16. And this is what's called Spy Wednesday. Spy Wednesday was something that was a phrase, maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't, but it became pretty popular late 1800s. And it was all about this idea of spy being defined as rebel, treasonous kind of idea, right? And you can know who we're talking about. Matthew 26, 14 through 16. One of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment on, he sought an opportunity to betray Jesus. As I mentioned, the definition of spy in the late 1800s was the idea of treasonous, traitor, and a person that would be ambushed or to ensnare. This is who we know as Judas Iscariot. Now, some people think that Judas was being greedy, that it was about the 30 pieces of silver. Maybe, maybe not. Others think that Judas was simply trying to force Jesus to overthrow the Romans. You know, Judas was probably a zealot, and he was a political figure, and he wanted Jesus to overthrow the Romans quickly. We don't really know what his motivation was, other than he did what he did. He sells him out for 30 pieces of silver, which is very, very, it's chump change. And you'll notice in the text that Matthew records the betrayal just after a worship in Bethany. Remember, look back in this text later on. Don't do it now. Later on, look back in this text. Right before here, Mary of Bethany, Mary is washing his feet, is anointing him with her feet and this expensive perfume. Right? And the apostles are just, we could use that money for the poor. Right? And Jesus rebukes them, and Jesus says, your money is something that you value much more than you should. You know, this woman, she's given everything. And if it is Mary, that's what tradition says, it's Mary of Bethany. And if that's the case, then she didn't have a whole lot to give, but she gave everything she had, and that was the jar of expensive perfume. So, what is it about money that seems to entrap us? This is probably more of a temptation for us than it was for them in the ancient Near East, at least a big portion of society for us than in the ancient Near East. I read somewhere the other day that it's a crazy number. It's above 85% of Americans would be considered wealthy throughout the rest of the world. I mean, it's a crazy number. I don't remember exactly what it is, so don't quote me on that. But it's a high number, right? If you're middle class in America, you are wealthy throughout the rest of the world, right? But we like our power. We like our prestige. We like to keep up with the Joneses, right? Oh, so-and-so got a new car. Oh, so-and-so got a new house. Oh, did you see what they did? Yeah, well, we can't look bad here. Maybe it's about control. In other words, do you use your money as an act of worship? That's what she did, right? She broke the jar of expensive perfume, poured it over his feet, wiped his feet with her hair, worship, anointed him is what the text says. Or you can hope to control the money, like the apostles were doing. And it was about self-centeredness. And I think that's maybe leads us to look into Judas's soul for just a second. Mary worshiped while Judas tried to enforce his will. Whether you think it was the money or instigating this the Romans being overthrown. And I would ask you, we don't have time to do it tonight, but I would ask you to look back at Matthew chapter 6, 19 through 24. That's the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven and on earth, where rust and moth will not destroy. But that's part of the Sermon on the Mount. That's Matthew 6, 19 through 24. And don't just read it, but pray about it and then follow through with it. Maybe it is that God wants you to give more to the church. Maybe He wants you to give to a ministry. Maybe He wants you to give up control of something that you've always had control of. I don't know what it'll be, but I would ask you to pray about it and do whatever God tells you to do. I've asked my Sunday school class to consider what the Holy Spirit is speaking to them, and I'll ask you all to do that. What is the Holy Spirit telling you when you spend time in prayer? And then what have you done about it, right? If He tells you to do something, have you followed through? And last but not least, let's look over at John chapter 13. John 13. So we've talked about Wednesday. Let's get to the next, probably the next day. I'm not much into, you can argue about all kinds of things, coffee shops, but people argue about chronology of Passion Week and all that kind of stuff. And I think you can get lost in the weeds. I don't get hung up on all that kind of stuff because it doesn't really matter as far as theologically. I believe that Jesus died on the cross. I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. I believe He's God in the flesh. I believe that 3 days later He walked out of the tomb bodily. I believe all those things. I don't need to tell you whether it was Wednesday night or Thursday night that He had a meal. You follow what I'm saying? But we get caught up in secondary issues sometimes. And I'm just telling you that because you may read something. I read something today about that. People were arguing about what was the day, what time was it, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, you can get caught up in that. But here's John 13, one of my favorite texts in the New Testament. Now this is probably, it's not probably, it is a meal. It's maybe the Passover meal, maybe not Passover meal, maybe Wednesday night, maybe Thursday night. But I want you to see what it says. I'm going to read it fairly quickly because all you know this text, but it'll be good to go back and review it. John 13, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that the hour had come to depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, notice this phrase, he loved them to the end. Underline that, highlight it, do something with that phrase. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, he rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around the waist. So he already looks like a servant. He already looks like a slave. You hear that? So when you go into a house in the ancient Near East, and you come to visit my house, I'm going to have a slave over here, and his job is to wash your feet, right? Take the towel from around his waist, dry your feet, and then he disappears. That's what a slave does in the ancient Near East. That's what a slave does. That's the word doulos that we get even in the New Testament. You elders know what I'm talking about when I say the word doulos. We've talked about that before. But Jesus, this is God in the flesh, becomes the slave that night. That should send off bells and whistles. And it does for Peter, right? And we'll get to Peter in a second. Peter's like, no way, right? But just keep that in mind. He's a slave. He's a servant, right? Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel that was wrapped around him. Now remember, they spent 3.5 years with Jesus. They all believe he's the Messiah to some extent. They all believe that Jesus is the Messiah. And this is so contrary to thinking that the one sent from God is going to become a slave, is going to become a servant. Okay? He came to Simon Peter, here's the objection, who said to him, Lord, seriously? I believe, remember I said in Matthew chapter 6, I said you're the Christ. I said you're the one sent from God. Now you're gonna be a slave? You're gonna wash my feet? Do you wash my feet? Makes no sense. Jesus said to him, if I don't wash you, you have no share with me. Now that would preach, man. I could probably preach 2 weeks on that verse alone, right? How many people get into baptistry and have never been washed? So, unless I wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not only my feet only, but also my hands and my head. And Jesus said to him, the one who has bathed does not need to be washed except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him. That was why he said, not every one of you are clean. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments, and then notice, as I said, the servant normally just disappears, right? He's not welcome to the table. It's not his table. He's not welcome to the table. He disappears. He's outside, out of mind, right? It's like, I don't know how many of you grew up and we had the adult table at Thanksgiving and we had the kids' table, right? There were just so many people that could sit around. You know what I'm talking about? Outside, out of mind, right? Okay, I'm going to fix your plate. You go over there and sit or whatever. This is kind of like outside, out of mind, but here he resumes his place, right? It's his table. He's the one that told him to go prepare the meal. He's the one that he sits at the head of the table. So he resumes his place at the table. And he said to them, do you understand what I've done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet. In other words, if I've become your servant, if I've become your slave, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should also do as I've done to you. I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. In other words, you can have them all up here, But if they stay up here and you don't do them, I'm not speaking of all of you, he says. I know whom I have chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. He knows Judas Iscariot, right? I'm telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you now believe that I am he. Truly I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. And then he goes on to talk about Judas Iscariot. So he knows he's about to be betrayed. He's going to be sent to the cross. The cross, the most brutal execution device that the Romans would ever use. But his attention was focused on his disciples, not himself. He knew he would leave his disciples behind, yet he took the time to love them to the end. Notice that phrase again, first part of the text, right? And he loved them to the end. He loved them fully. He loved them completely. He loved them despite. This is agape love. He loved them regardless that they're going to be scattered like a covey of quail. We always think about Judas being the betrayer, but it's Peter that betrays him. It's Matthew that betrays him. It's all of them that betray Jesus. It's you and I that betray him. But he loved them to the end. So Jesus shows he's a servant, and he ties that towel around his waist. He washes the feet of the disciples. Slaves who, as I mentioned, they disappear. They don't hang out. They're not invited to hang out. But Jesus, it's his table. He resumes his place in verse 12. He attempts to teach them what they should do. And then notice that in verse 17 again, if you know these things, blessed are you if you not know them. Not if you go to church every Sunday. Not if you've been around the church for 40, 50 years of your life. Not if you're, on the roll somewhere. But if you actually do something. If you're actually a follower of Jesus, right? Not just a fan. So what might be the significance of Jesus, God in the flesh, to become servant and teach service to the disciples? In other words, if he was the Messiah, and I think he was, I believe he was, if he was the Christ, if he's the anointed one, the one sent from God, why would one of his last teachings focus on being a servant to one another? Why would it be about being a slave to one another? Why would it be about love? I had a couple questions for you to consider as we leave. Are you quick to experience Jesus in this way? Do you perceive Jesus to be a servant? Have you ever thought about that? Has that text ever stuck out to you as Jesus being a slave? I mean, I don't think we in the Western world, we have no concept of what just took place at this meal. I don't think we can completely grasp it. And we can say, okay, wash feet. I've done that before. I've washed people's feet in a service before, as an illustration. Uncomfortable? Yeah, it's a little bit weird, as far as I'm concerned. I'll tell you what's even more weird and what's more humbling is when people wash your feet.
Amen.
You understand what I'm saying?
I hate that I feel more like Peter and want to just reject it. Whenever I've been in feet washing services, honestly, some of my most impactful spiritual things outside of like my calling, things like that, have been at feet washing services.
Yeah.
I find them amazing. I don't want them to become commonplace, but I do want them because they're at a point that tend to happen at points when I need them.
I don't believe, the elders can correct me, but I don't believe they're going to be commonplace here at Southwestern. But the point I'm trying to make, though, is Jesus is the servant. Jesus is the slave here. And most of us don't think of Jesus as being a slave or Jesus being a servant. So when he says, do you understand what I've done for you? What's the answer? No, we don't. We really don't, right? And we'll talk more about this on Sunday. But Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I looked at Keith Sunday and said, man, does this make a whole lot of sense? This is God in the flesh, right, hanging on the cross. And you talk about servant, you talk about slave, right? And there's a Roman centurion, get this. There's a Roman centurion, a guy who's in charge of people, who hears Jesus say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. And the centurion, this Greek guy, says, surely this was the Son of God. This is not supposed to happen. Do you know what we just did to him? And he's saying, forgive them? What? Right? And that's the Jesus we worship. So, all that to say, I hope I know people are a little bit upset we're not doing Good Friday. I'm well aware of that. I'm not anti-Good Friday. We will do things in the future about Easter. But I want you to hang out right here with these texts the next few days. Because there's something that happens in Passion Week, and they all mean something. They all mean, at least the things that I've kind of primed the pump for, right? And maybe find that accountability partner and talk about, hey, this is what I saw. What did you see? Hey, this is what I got. What did you get? Right? Iron sharpens iron, is what the Bible says. Fair enough? Any questions? Concerns? Pushback? Heartburn? You good? I'm looking for somebody to pray and nobody's. Jonathan's going to pray.
Father, we come to you today and praise your name. We thank you for this community of believers that lift each other up and support each other and grow together to become disciples of you. I pray that you will help us accept the challenges put before us of what you're trying to teach us as being a servant of what it means truly to be a follower of Jesus. Pray that you'll be with us as we go out into the community, and that there will be not a doubt on any person that your light is shining through our actions and through our words. In your name we pray, amen.
Remember the prayer